Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session of the seminar Pathos of Modernity by Nathan Brown. Nathan, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, a few remarks about logistical details. I see that discussion posts are coming in more and more. That's great. So if you haven't posted yet to the front stream of the Google Classroom page, please do so. I'll continue to receive those, but it would be great to have all of the discussion posts in by Monday. Um, and then Caleb is asking when the final presentation or essays due, December 12th. Um, and that gives you a lot of time. I'm very happy to receive papers before then. Um, but I want to have my grades in, I want to review the papers by mid-December. So if you have any questions about that, I'll also maybe post some more specific information, but there's not much more specific information. It's just it's a critical paper on any aspect of the poems or the secondary text that you want to consider. But I will, yeah, again, I'll present some more information on that on the Google Classroom page shortly. Um, Okay, so as I mentioned last time, this week I'm going to proceed a little bit differently by sort of more formally reading a paper, and I can say a little bit about the context of that. So we're moving on to Andenken this week, Remembrance, Holderlin's poem that he wrote most likely in the spring of 1803, recollecting his months in Bordeaux from January until May 1802. Um, and just to frame the concern of this paper a little bit, I'll just say in advance, this is part of a book project that I've been working on for a while, from which this seminar partly stems. The project is titled "The Irony of Ground: Studies in the Poetics of Romantic Modernity," and um, and the idea of the project is basically to interrogate the concept of romantische Poesie articulated by Friedrich Schlegel in the Athenaeum fragments. So from the late 1790s, in the context of Schlegel's group, the Jena Romantics, that he was involved with, and in Schlegel's remarks on what he calls romantische Poesie, which he sometimes calls the romantic kind of poetry, but he makes a sort of vertiginous and strange claim that romantische Poesie includes all the arts, includes all the sciences, includes the ethical conduct of everyday life, includes political life, etc. So he basically conceives of like every every branch of knowledge or every aspect of practical existence as included within the category of romantische Poesie. And so, of course, the question has always been, what does this really mean? And how could such a term or concept have any specificity? But I think that of course, that can be reconstructed, and many people have worked on this question. But part of what's at issue is an expansive concept of poetry understood as poiesis, as production or making, and then to see this sort of moment of genesis in all of the different arts, or in political life, or the ethical conduct of the community, etc., or in the sciences, as bound up with this sort of moment of genesis, which could be conceived as poiesis. And so, let's say that Schlegel wants to put poetry into the field of this broader understanding of poesis. So for me, the question is the relationship between poetry as a specifically literary practice and poiesis more broadly conceived as production or as making, and to think about that as a problem and to put some pressure, also on what Schlegel is saying in this particular Athenaeum fragment. So anyway, the way that I deal with this in the book project is I take up this whole issue as bearing upon the problem of ground in post-Kantian philosophy in Germany, but also in political modernity in the wake of the French Revolution. So most perhaps in philosophy, this problem comes into focus most clearly with Fichte, with his lectures on the Wissenschaftslehre in 1794, where the project is to ground um, the subject. Um, and there the many paradoxes attendant upon Fichte's effort to ground, what Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception, trouble this entire generation of German thinkers. I can't really go into that, but my point is, I'm taking up this problem of ground. I'm conceiving it in terms of the irony of ground, that every movement of ungrounding also has to posit a new ground, which in turn will be ungrounded, etc. And to think about this as a way of considering the ungrounding of relationship of the specificity of the arts, but also the way in which when they come into contact with one another, they, as it were, posit new grounds, that the production of artworks is itself a practice of positing or producing a new ground, which at the same time is an act of ungrounding. So this is why the concept of irony is important to dealing with this in a sort of dialectical way. So the relation also between irony and the dialectic is important to the project. For our purposes here, um, this is a chapter of the book. The book really works from this moment in the 1790s right up to the present. It moves across music, cinema, painting, poetry. Um, I try to do case studies of the different arts and relationships between the different arts. And then I have several chapters at the beginning of the project which bear upon revolutionary politics. So including a chapter on Basquiat's citations of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony in his late works, and how the Eroica Symphony is related to the problem of Napoleon's relation to the Haitian Revolution. I'm taking that up via Basquiat. I also have a chapter on Aimé Césaire's poetry, the relationship of the Negritude movement to the Haitian Revolution. And then between those two, this chapter on Andenken bears upon the way in which Hölderlin's trip to Bordeaux in 1802 brings him into contact with the context of the Atlantic world, with the context of colonialism and slavery, particularly Napoleon's attempt to reimpose slavery in the French colonies in 1802, and how this is perhaps sort of dimly touched upon by the poem, or enters into the poem in certain ways, of which Hölderlin is not entirely conscious, most likely. And I want to try to find a way of reading that can attend to this kind of touching of the poem upon issues of the most, grave historical importance that perhaps the poet himself is only tangentially aware of, or perhaps does not even mean to refer to. And so this is the problem of the paper. So this is a version of this chapter which is significantly shorter than the chapter. It's about half the length of the chapter. But I've delivered it as a paper just a couple weeks ago, also at Cambridge, and I'll deliver it as a paper now. And so this will hopefully raise for us some broader questions about the historical context of Hölderlin's work and the pathos of modernity in a slightly different register. Okay, so without further ado, I will plunge into this paper. It's about 23 pages long. It's about a 50-minute paper. And then we can do Q&A, and then we'll take a break, and then we can have discussion of Andenken. The first thing I'm gonna do is read this poem in the translation that I've done with my colleague Stephen Ross, and then plunge into the paper itself. Let me just see here if I can. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll read the poem. So, Remembrance. The northeasterly blows, most beloved of winds to me, since it promises fiery spirit and good voyage to mariners. But go now and greet the lovely Garonne and the gardens of Bordeaux, there where the path runs down along the sharp bank and the brook plunges deep into the river. but above, a noble pair of oaks and white poplars look out. Still, this comes back to me, and how the broad crowns of the elm wood bend over the mill, but a fig tree grows in the courtyard. On festive days, the brown women walk just there on silken ground in the time of March, when night and day are equal, and lulling breezes draw down leisurely paths heavy with golden dreams. But someone pass me, full of the dark light, the fragrant cup, so that I might rest, for sleep would be sweet under shadows. It is no good to be forlorn with mortal thoughts. Yet a conversation is good, and to say what's in the heart, to hear all about days of love and deeds that have been done. But where are the friends? Bellarmine with the companions. Some shy away from going to the source, for wealth begins in the sea. Like painters, they bring together the beauty of earth, and they do not scorn winged war, nor living alone, year long, under the stripped mast, where no city festival, nor play of strings, nor native dance glimmers through the night. But now to Indians the men have gone, at the windy peak there, by the vineyard hills, where the Dordogne descends, and together with the majestic Garonne sea-wide, the flood goes out. But it takes and gives memory, the sea, and love also attentively fixes the eyes. But what lasts, the poets establish. Okay, so I've posted that document as a Dropbox link. The paper is titled Dark Light, the Repressed Recognition of Colonialism and Slavery in Hölderlin's Andenken. On December 6th or 7th, 1801, Friedrich Hölderlin set out on his journey from Nürtingen to Bordeaux, where he would take up a position as tutor in the household of Consul Daniel Christoph Meyer, a German émigré and a wealthy wine merchant. He arrived on January 28th, 1802. After writing to notify his mother of his arrival, Hölderlin wrote only one additional letter during his time in the French port city, prompted by the death of his grandmother. We know almost nothing about his life there. Before leaving Nürtingen in December, he had assured his friend Bollendorf in a letter that he would remain a German, quote, even if the needs of the heart and stomach should drive me to Tahiti, unquote. But Hölderlin spent only a few months in Bordeaux before heading home. On May 10th, he received a passport to travel back to Strasbourg. In the spring of 1803, so about a year later, most likely, he would inscribe in his great lyric Andenken a recollection of the city's gardens, its vineyard hills, its noble oaks, its lulling breezes, its fragrant wine, its festival of the spring equinox, its commerce and its mariners, the oceanic rhythms of its mnemonic economy. On December 14th, 1801, so about a week after Hölderlin left Nürtingen, as winds shifted to the northeast after weeks of unfavorable weather, a squadron of ships under the command of French General Charles Leclerc set sail towards Saint-Dominique, so the name of Haiti before the revolution, set sail towards Saint-Dominique from the port city of Brest on the northwest coast of France. That squadron would eventually be joined by squadrons departing from Le Havre, Toulon, Cadiz, constituting an expedition of some 20,000 troops dispatched by Napoleon to wrest the French colony from the control of Toussaint Louverture, the governor general of the island. Leclerc's ships appeared off the coast of Saint-Dominique on January 29th, 1802. So the day after Hölderlin arrived in Bordeaux, that's when Leclerc's ships appeared off the coast of Saint-Domingue. By May 6th, Leclerc's forces had won a Pyrrhic victory. So Toussaint had surrendered, and a month later he would be captured and imprisoned in France, where he died in April 1803. On May 20th, 1802, Napoleon proclaimed the reinstatement of slavery and the slave trade in French colonies that were recovered from England through the Peace of Amiens uh, of March that year. So the colonies Martinique, Tobago, Saint Lucia, as well as Mauritius and Réunion. Though it did not apply to Saint-Domingue, the reimposition of slavery, the threat posed by Napoleon's proclamation sparked renewed waves of struggle against Leclerc's army, which would be decimated by yellow fever in the summer months. By the time Leclerc himself died of the disease in November 1802, his army was headed toward its final defeat, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines' army toward its final victory, which would take place at Vertières on November 18th, 1803. So thus, Holderlin's time in Bordeaux overlapped almost exactly with the initial phase of Leclerc's campaign in Saint-Domingue, from late January to early May 1802, and therefore with a turning point in the history of the Haitian Revolution, and also in the vexed relationship between post-revolutionary France and the question of slavery. That is, Holderlin, a German partisan of the French Revolution who remained committed to its ideals, traveled to France and lived in the first city of its maritime bourgeoisie, precisely at the moment of a singular crisis in those ideals of the revolution. That is, Napoleon's campaign to seize control of his most profitable colony from its revolutionary leader and to reestablish slavery throughout the French Empire. Though the details of this political and ideological context would likely have remained obscure to the German poet, the gravity of the moment could not altogether have been lost on him. His employer belonged to the merchant class and social world of those whose fortunes had been made in the triangular trade structuring transatlantic slavery, whose incomes depended upon colonial commerce, and whose lives were thus deeply bound up with the fate of the colonies. Indeed, Consul Meyer, so Holderlin's employer, had an intimate connection with the most important of those colonies. His wife, Marie Henriette Saint-André, was a French Creole born in Saint-Domingue. As soon as news of the war between Leclerc's forces and Toussaint's army reached Bordeaux on March 19th of 1802, so note that there's a lag in the events in Saint-Domingue and the reporting of them in Bordeaux of about 2 months. As soon as news of this war was reported in the newspaper L'Echo de Commerce, these developments became a fixture in the press, and their implications would have been a matter of deep concern and constant discussion among the maritime bourgeoisie. If news of war in Saint-Domingue reached Bordeaux in the midst of Holderlin's stay in the city, how might a closer consideration of this aspect of his French sojourn alter our view of its significance? How might we situate and read Andenken as a poem bound up not only with the history of French colonialism, but also, more specifically, with the wrenching, complex passage between revolution and independence in Haiti, between the abolition of slavery and its reestablishment in the French colonies? And how might doing so change our understanding of the poetics of recollection in Andenken? So in every strophe of Andenken, there are elements that bring into question the poem's relationship to the whole of the Atlantic world of colonial trade. So the opening invocation of the northeasterly wind, which would favor a voyage to the West Indies. The ambiguous reference to the brown women who walk on silken ground during the festive days of March. The vineyard hills and the dark light of the wine bound up with the triangular trade of commodities from Bordeaux to the west coast of Africa, of slaves to the colonies, and of goods from the colonies back to Bordeaux. The tales of love and deeds likely told by some of those who come and go along these courses. The mortal thoughts that these tales might help the speaker forget. The obscure remark that wealth begins in the sea and that some shy away from going to the source. The seafaring companions who, like painters, bring together the beauty of the earth and do not scorn winged war. And finally, the emendation of the final strophe's opening lines in the manuscript, where the destination of the mariner's voyage is altered from Indien in German, so which would mean India, to Indiern, which means Indians. Well, we can take a look at the manuscript later on. But critical attention to the question of just how these elements relate to the poem's contact with Atlantic history, the Atlantic history of colonialism and slavery, has been hindered by oversight on the one hand and interpretive overconfidence on the other. The history of this reception begins with Heidegger's indifference to the geographical and historical specificity of Undenken's reference to the brown women, for which Adorno takes him to task. So here I'm just going to run through some of the readings of this poem, or this problem in the poem. So in Adorno's essay, well, quote, Holderlin's lines are enraptured with the erotic imago of the Mediterranean woman, Adorno argues. Heidegger merely takes this imago as an occasion to pass unnoticed to the praise of German women, who are, as Adorno puts it, simply not the concern of the poem being explicated, but are rather dragged in by the hair. So for Adorno, this exemplifies Heidegger's broader mishandling of the question of the foreign in Holderlin, his absorption of what is foreign into a nationalist celebration of what is German. But while Adorno's critique is certainly warranted, he also forecloses the question of the foreign that's at issue in the figure of the brown women by overlooking the referential ambiguity that's at stake in this aspect of the poem. Given the prevalence of former slaves, of gens de couleur, of Creole émigrés, and of refugees from the colonies in Bordeaux in the early 19th century, so particularly following waves of migration amid revolutionary and imperialist wars of the 1790s, we cannot know whether Holderlin's reference to die braunen Frauen, so the brown women, designates what Adorno calls the Mediterranean woman, or involves another sense of what is foreign, that is, the brown women who have arrived in the maritime city through the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the geography of the French colonies. This possibility, registered precisely as a possibility rather than as a referential certainty, draws the historical, geographical, political, and ideological problem of racialization into the poem as a consequence of its reference to skin color, due to the contextual ambiguity of the relationship between skin color and race in Holderlin's Bordeaux. In a 2005 article, Avital Ronell seems to gesture toward this ambiguity by referring to the brown women as women of color and also as dark-skinned women. But Ronell does not explicitly register this as a significant equivocation, nor does she pursue the historical context that makes it one. Michael Franz, on the other hand, does situate the poem in the context of the triangular trade and the complex history of Atlantic migration between the colonies and Bordeaux, and he cites the prevalence of gens de couleur in the city. He also mentions the overlapping chronology of Leclerc's campaign in Saint-Domingue with Holderlin's stay in Bordeaux. But his article doesn't assess the significance of this context for an integral reading of the poem. Their colonial background must not be forgotten, he writes of the brown women, but they are first of all brought into the picture as representatives of one of the two genders. So the rationale for this priority of gendered race is unclear to me, since these figures are, first of all, referred to as brown and Frauen. But Franz's apparent certainty concerning their colonial background is also too determinate. So while it's crucial to recognize the relevance of French colonialism to the connotative field of this reference, again, we cannot know the status of the women's background. So whether they are of African descent, whether they are from the colonies, whether they're of mixed race or French Creoles, or suntanned women native to the south of France, which is what most commentators on the poem have assumed. Franz's assignment of determinate reference, their colonial background, is different than Adorno's invocation of the erotic imago of the Mediterranean women, but the same interpretive overconfidence is at issue. So sustaining the ambiguity of the referent is crucial to grappling with the historical situation of the poem, because Bordeaux in 1802 is exactly the sort of contextual field that makes such a reference ambiguous, or that we could say determines it as indeterminate. Like Franz, David Farrell Krell recognizes the importance of colonialism and transatlantic slavery to the contextual background of Andenken. But his handling of that context suggests a desire to protect the poem from its intrusion by sustaining a mood of interpretive naivete. So, regarding the poem's reference to mariners' tales about days of love and deeds that have been done, Krell argues, quote, that if spirit loves colonies, as Bread and Wine says, it is not for the sake of colonization. It's rather because the sailors, like Aphrodite's sea itself, carry so many gifts to the shore, above all, gifts of stories about things that have happened and loves that have been won and lost. So here, the defensive movement of the poem itself, that is, heroic tales which displace mortal thoughts, is adopted as the framework not only for its interpretation, but also more general statements concerning the relation between spirit and colonialism. While Krell notes Bordeaux's involvement in the slave trade as a context for the significance of the brown women, he then falls into paternalistic projections. So he writes, over the years, a large African population formed in and around Bordeaux. Many black women or brown women served as dressmakers and beauticians, some of them achieving relative wealth and status in the city, along with a certain measure of freedom. One can only imagine Holderlin's astonishment in the face of such beautiful human beings, unlike any he had ever seen before. So here, Krell imputes psychological reactions to the poet quite without warrant, I would say, but leaves aside deeper reflection upon the cultural and political contradictions of French revolutionary and colonial history. These contradictions are also left aside in what I think is the most important commentary on Undenken that we have, that is, Dieter Henrich's extraordinary essay, The Course of Remembrance. Henrich places great emphasis on the geographical particulars of Bordeaux, situating these in their historical context. Yet, when he notes that Bordeaux was, in the 18th century, France's most important international port, the centrality of the slave trade to that history goes unmentioned, and the relevance of the French colonies to the city's maritime economy is only glancingly touched upon. Henrich is exhaustively concerned with why the bank of the river might be described as sharp, or with the distinct locations of the gardens of Bordeaux and the windy peak at the confluence of the Garonne and the Dordogne, or with the seasonal viability of arguments that the golden dreams with which the slow pathways are heavy may refer to the drifting of pollen, and with conditions under which the ground might be described as silky or silken. But while discussing the sensuous texture and this tone and colors in the second strophe of the poem, Henrich has nothing to say about how we should understand the particular significance of Holderlin's reference to the brown women. So rather, he offers a sweeping metaphysical interpretation of the poem. So quoting Henrich here, the stride of the women on the silken ground in the lulling breezes in the spring's balance of day and night attains pure presence, not by the hushed movement of the image alone, but also by the elevated awareness and experience of the day lifted up out of the cycle of seasons, corresponding to the light, measured step of the women. To be attuned to one and all, where what has been, what is to come, and what at once pervades all reality are brought together, in dreams of the past and future, in feeling at home with all things, calm in anticipation, safeguarded on all paths. Henrich reads the strophe as nothing less than an evocation of the absolute, an attunement to one and all, bringing together what has been, what is to come, and what at once pervades all reality. But if the figure of the brown women draws the question of race into the poem, and therefore the necessity of thinking through how this reference may be bound up with histories of migration, miscegenation, and colonialism, then the strophe's evocation of feeling at home with all things, common anticipation, safeguarded on all paths, becomes considerably complicated. Henrich does grant that the poet is in a foreign place and that his speaking of the brown women may also hint at the fact that he remains excluded from their celebrations. But like Adorno, Henrich doesn't pursue the ambiguity of the foreign which is at issue here, its geographical scope or the relationship between race and skin color that it puts into question. Henrik is likewise eager to leave aside the ambiguity of the mariner's destination in the first line of the poem's final strophe, which Holderlin revised from nach Indien, so to India, to zu Indiern, or to Indians. Rejecting the common interpretation of this line as referring to the West Indies, Henrik argues that, quote, the poem actually speaks of a sea voyage to India, not the West Indies, that is, French colonies in the Caribbean, as is often thought. But elsewhere, Henrik equivocates on this claim through a somewhat tendentious characterization of Holderlin's revision. Quote, when he decided to write Manner instead of Freunde, Henrik writes, Holderlin also happened to contemplate replacing Indian, or India. In one draft, the stroke that crosses out Freunde in the second line also goes through Indian in the previous line. While Holderlin did not want to keep, or sorry, why Holderlin did not want to keep India as the definite destination of the journey needn't concern us here. So that's Henrik. On the manuscript, however, one can see that the stroke begins above Indienne and passes diagonally through both words in the center of the two lines as if to cross out the lines which are then rewritten below. So there is no warrant for the equivocal remark that Holderlin also happened to contemplate replacing Indienne. That is, he does replace it. And here I just want to pause actually and show you this manuscript because, hold on a second here. It's an interesting example of how these little details about the status of the manuscripts might have very weighty implications for our understanding of the poem. So you can see that these are the two lines at issue, and this is the stroke going through these two lines. And so Henrik wants to portray this as if he just is thinking about crossing out Indian, but my view of this would be that he's crossing out, from top to bottom, these two lines, which are then rewritten below. And so in the Frankfurter Ausgabe, you can see the initial version of the lines and then the rewriting of the lines below. So we can come back to this, but these issues of textual criticism in Holderlin are often quite interesting. Whatever motivates Henrik's contortions, that is, his slight misrepresentations of how Holderlin is dealing with the manuscript, his insistence that the destination of the mariners is not the West Indies is consistent with his elision of the history of the slave trade from his account of maritime commerce in Bordeaux. So it seems to me that Holderlin's strange revision and the ambiguity of the referent here, the destination of the mariners, may be the index of an interlingual catachresis stemming from the French term onde. So that is to say, Holderlin is transliterating, is translating a French term into German and mixes up Indienne or Indierne as the correct way to write onde. Seems like a possibility. As Richard Seaberth remarks in his notes to his translation of Ondenken, the naming of the West Indies itself derives from a geographical catachresis, that is to say, a misreference, a confusion of East and West historically associated with the term, that is, Indies. But as I've argued in the case of the poem's reference to the brown women, however we judge Holderlin's revision of nach Indien to zu Indiern, what has to be sustained is the ambiguity of the referent, as well as the indeterminacy of the poet's intention. This ambiguity and indeterminacy connote the poem's registration of more than its author knows, and of more than its interpreters can be certain of, however certain they may seem to be. This is not merely due to a general indeterminacy of intention or reference as these bear upon poetic meaning, but rather to the specific contextual determinacy of the place and time the poem recalls, where and when, as Henrik suggests, mariners could be setting off to India, or, as other commentators insist, to the West Indies. Since vessels were traveling to both of these places from Bordeaux, the uncertainty implicit in Holderlin's revision draws this compound context into consideration and debate, thus involuntarily recalling, as a token of remembrance, an inaugural catachresis of colonial misprision. That is, the displacement of names, the reversal of coordinates, the not knowing where one is, which is always latent as a possibility of the foreign. The possible significance of such a token, registered as a souvenir of misrecognition, bears upon the entirety of Hölderlin's poetic enterprise and the experience of modernity registered in his work. In order to read Andenken along those lines, we can now reconstruct the context of the poem from a perspective making legible the complex determinations of its historical sense. Okay, so now a section on the historical context of Bordeaux in 1802 in relation to Saint-Domingue, and then finally a reading of the poem along these lines. So let's return to the context with which I began. In January 1802, Hölderlin comes to a city which knows it is on the cusp of a major transformation of its post-revolutionary history, but which does not know how that transformation will play out. The day after Hölderlin arrives in Bordeaux, Leclerc's fleet is spotted off the coast of Saint-Domingue, but news of this landing and news of Toussaint's decision to go to war against Leclerc's army is not reported until March. In the early months of 1802, as Hölderlin settles into the city, Bordeaux's commercial press seems to anticipate the reestablishment of slavery in Saint-Domingue. So on January 7th, L'Écho du Commerce urges residents of the city to read a book that was just published in Bordeaux titled Les Soirées Bermudiennes, so Bermudian Dialogues, which, quote, reveals the causes of the misfortunes that have occurred since the revolution in Saint-Domingue, and demonstrates the ignorance or the bad faith of those who claimed that blacks in the colonies were the most unfortunate of men. So that's from the newspaper. The advertisement continues. In a city whose commerce exists only through the colonies, one cannot look with indifference upon a text revealing the causes of the events that have worked to ruin French Saint-Domingue and the means to restore the flourishing of its culture and prosperity. This work is all the more likely to pique the curiosity of fellow citizens, appearing at the moment when a naval division and considerable forces are heading to the colony. So, written by a former colonist in Saint-Domingue, Félix Carteau, this book portrays the blacks of Saint-Domingue as endemically irrational and ungovernable. It elicits sympathy for the plight of displaced white colonists, and it argues that the violence of slavery has been greatly exaggerated by partisans of racial equality. As the scholar Tessie Liu notes, this book by Carteau was part of a wave of pro-slavery literature published in France before and during Leclerc's expedition to Saint-Domingue, wherein arguments for cultural and economic regeneration in the colonies were sutured to apologies for white supremacy and revisionist accounts of a kind of paternalist benevolence of slavery. In early 1802, however, Bordeaux's commercial press still seems to view Toussaint Louverture as a responsible governor of Saint-Domingue who's loyal to France and also to Napoleon, and who can therefore be expected to collaborate with General Leclerc upon his arrival. On February 15th, reporting on Toussaint's handling of a rebellion that took place the previous October, L'Écho du Commerce states that, quote, he has taken all appropriate measures to restore order and to punish those responsible for the disturbance. So in the weeks after Hölderlin arrives in Bordeaux, Toussaint is portrayed by the press as a stabilizing figure, working to, quote, assure the tranquility of the colony and prevent new difficulties. But this view would change radically when news of his declaration of war against Leclerc would reach Bordeaux in March. So it's on March 19th that news arrives of Leclerc's landing in Saint-Domingue and of his efforts to reestablish order, quoting the press, after the burning of its capital by General Henri Christophe. This report mentions a letter from one of Toussaint's secretaries making clear that he'd been preparing for months to oppose the expedition. And the report concludes with a note from Leclerc himself, quote, despite the atrocious conduct of Toussaint, I do not intend to deviate from the general instructions of the first consul, so that is Napoleon. On March 21st, okay, so which is exactly the date of the spring equinox, which is recalled in the second strophe of Andenken, that is, when night and day are equal. So on March 21st, the paper Tableau du Bordeaux prints Napoleon's proclamation from November of 1801, which is addressed to habitants de Saint-Domingue, calling for the people of Saint-Domingue to rally to Leclerc, who, quote, brings abundance and peace. Napoleon declares that whoever separates from the Captain General will be a traitor to the country, and the wrath of the Republic will devour him as fire devours your dried sugarcane. Napoleon constructs this proximity of promise and threat as a narrative of benevolent inclusion. So he writes, France has been, like Saint-Domingue, prey to factions and torn by civil war and foreign wars. All peoples have embraced the French, have sworn to them peace and friendship. All the French have embraced them as well, and sworn to be friends and brothers to all. Embrace the French as well, and rejoice once more in seeing your friends and brothers of Europe. So this is Napoleon's invitation to the people of Saint-Domingue. So either annihilation on the one hand, or a new era of universal brotherhood on the other. This is the kind of last judgment heralded by Leclerc's arrival in Saint-Domingue. By March 31st, as the reality of armed resistance to Leclerc's troops becomes clear, L'Écho du Commerce prints a vicious essay titled Liberté des Noirs from a Parisian newspaper, which sarcastically attacks the naivete of white egalitarianism. Quote, so quoting this article, they are men like us. This African sold like a brute and at a cheap price is a man like us. This African never constrained by laws, never softened by society, who obeys only his lower senses. This barbarous and ferocious African is a man like us. Fools. So this kind of recourse to racist vituperation would not have been unanimous in Bordeaux. And it's important to recognize that actually 10 years earlier, 9 years earlier, when slavery was abolished, the people of Bordeaux, the merchant bourgeoisie of Bordeaux, celebrated the abolition of slavery, even though it was against their own economic interests. But now, by the spring of 1802, this kind of formerly discredited racist discourse is once again viable in the public sphere, and it's openly espoused by commercial partisans of re-enslavement. So this surfacing of open racism from beneath the veneer of a dissembling paternalism amid the abrupt recognition of war in Saint-Domingue was no barrier to concomitant celebrations of peace. So indeed, the end of war with Britain that was promised by the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801, and then preliminary steps toward the Treaty of Amiens later that year, were a condition of possibility for Leclerc's expedition. So that is to say, peace with the British is a condition of possibility for the expedition to Saint-Domingue. The expedition itself was construed in the press as evidence of French pacifism. Quote, there is no better proof of the peaceful disposition of the French government than the expedition to Saint-Domingue, a government that redeploys its naval forces, which would be essential if war against the British were to recommence. Such a government cannot have hostile intentions. So when it was signed on March 25th of 1802, the Treaty of Amiens was announced in Bordeaux as the advent not only of universal peace, but also as inaugurating a new era of colonial discipline. So here's the paper on March 25th. Everywhere cries of joy and cheers for peace. War, this terrible sickness of peoples and of kings, has ceased its ravages. The news of a general and definitive peace fills with joy all friends of humanity, all those who want honorable work, that great wealth of nations, to regain its moral and beneficial influence. The colonies taken back from the hands of ferocious and hypocritical usurpers will be restored and submitted to the happy and peaceful reciprocity of labor and the relief of possession and protection by the metropole, unquote. So again, as Tessie Liu notes, the new fraternity among Europeans occasioned by the Treaty of Amiens, so the treaty with the British, was not only transnational, but also racial. So from the point of view of the white supremacist propaganda published in 1802, this is what Liu explains, quote, it made no sense that European countries fight and compete against one another along national or imperial divides. They should unite as whites to enjoy the fruits of the tropics by disciplining all blacks to realize the highest gains with the most efficient use of force. The survival of modern economies and civilizations required that those who occupied the zones of freedom police the zones of forced labor. So for European powers in the spring of 1802, metropolitan or European collaboration was the ground of colonial domination, and the establishment of peace was integral to the reestablishment of white supremacy. So unfortunately, the obfuscation of how peace between the French and British actually enabled colonial war in Saint-Domingue has been relayed from the print culture of 1802 to more recent contextualizations of Hölderlin's time in France. So the French Hölderlin scholar Jean-Pierre Lefebvre construes the Treaty of Amiens as, quote, the great cumulative peace, universal and quasi-millenarian. He notes that while he notes that the revolt of the blacks in Saint-Domingue also held the inhabitants of Bordeaux breathless during Hölderlin's time in the city, Lefebvre doesn't consider the significance of this context for the advent of universal peace. So he speaks about these two things as separate, as if they don't have anything to do with each other. Discussing the events leading to the Treaty of Amiens, Lefebvre writes that, quote, the papers of Bordeaux spoke of nothing else while Hölderlin was in the city. And Lefebvre only grants the, quote, the exception of ordinary announcements and the Toussaint Louverture in Saint-Domingue. So he portrays this as a sort of side issue. Such elisions have themselves become part of the context in which Die Braunen Frauen may appear to contemporary readers of Andenken. So bearing in mind the complicity of white supremacy in European peace in 1802, we see that it matters a great deal that we do not and cannot know whether the adjective brownen, so brown, refers to skin color or also to race. So to state the problem in the irrationally paradoxical terms of racializing ascription, we see why it matters that we cannot know whether or not these brown women are white. It matters because the significance of racial ascription and racial distinctions and the significance of their ambiguity was particularly fraught during and after these early months of 1802. As Julie Duprat argues, Bordeaux had been a place where people of African descent were relatively integrated into French society, with social circles of free people of color marked by close proximity to the white population, a proximity that became, as she notes, notably visible during religious celebrations, and also where, after abolition, quote, the active political participation of people of African descent in Bordeaux became visible for the first time in the public sphere. But Duprat notes that this integration into French society was short-lived, as Napoleon set about reversing the momentum of anti-slavery politics after seizing power in 1799. The reestablishment of slavery in most French colonies on May 20th, 1802, rendered indeterminate the status of former slaves living as free citizens in the metropole, so in France, during the previous decade. And it threw into doubt the status of slaves arriving in France after 1802. So, as Duprat asks, would they be considered as free under the decree of 1791, or would they remain slaves as they were in the colonies? On July 2nd, 1802, new legislation was introduced that limited the circulation of people of African descent between the colonies and France. And in January 1803, an edict prohibited racially mixed marriages in the metropole. Okay, so whatever the empirical recollection or authorial intention that subtends reference to the brown women in Andenken, the ambiguous significance of their presence in the poem resonates with the ambiguous transitional status of the enslaved, of free people of color, and of racial ascription itself between the spring equinox of 1802 and the time of Andenken's composition. So if it's true, as Henrik argues, that the image of the brown women portends an attunement to the one and all, where what has been, what is to come, and what pervades all reality are brought together, then we must now return to Hölderlin's Poetics of Remembrance while bearing in mind the context that we've been tracing, wherein the relationship between what is to come and what has been cannot be separated from the problem of freedom, which means in 1802, the problem of how race, slavery, and colonialism are bound up with the constitution of the one and all. Okay, so now to a reading of the poem, the final section of the paper. So again, To bear in mind this context while reading Andenken does not imply the supposition that its author would have borne this in mind while writing it. If Holderlin would likely have been aware of events in Saint-Domingue while he was in Bordeaux, through conversations or through the press, and if he likely interacted with people of color in the city and witnessed the poverty of Black refugee populations on the outskirts, as the scholar Jochen Berthoud speculates, his treatment of the maritime world in Undenken does not suggest a kind of self-consciously critical engagement with the political questions that I've been discussing. On the contrary, I would say the blithe or inattentive handling of colonial politics by such commentators as Krell or Henrik no doubt stems in part from the manner of the poem itself, wherein seafaring trades of love and adventure or deeds that have been done are presented as a cure for mortal thoughts with which one is forlorn, rather than as a source of such thoughts. The lyric speaker seems to identify with the maritime voyagers of Bordeaux, holding the northeasterly wind as the dearest of winds because it promises fiery spirit and good voyage. The mariners who do not scorn winged war are said to be like painters who bring together the beauty of the earth. An analogy which recalls a comparison in the archipelago of Mediterranean merchants to poets, who the gods love for sharing out the good gifts of the earth and uniting the near with the far. If in Undenken wealth begins in the sea, the accumulation of wealth and its relation to the sea doesn't seem to be understood as deriving from the history of the slave trade or of profits extracted from the plantation system or colonial rule. So rather, the poem suggests a kind of idealized exchange of goods that gathers and distributes, like painted representations, the diverse productivity of nature and the aesthetic pleasures of its bounty. One might best describe Andenken's construal of seafaring, of trade, and the Atlantic world as fond, allowing for all the connotations of that adjective, which I'll come back to. So nevertheless, the poem inscribes registrations of a context which exceeds the apparent simplicity of its political consciousness, registrations which, one might say, thus belong to its political unconscious. Or put differently, one might locate in the poem a kind of repressed recognition of that which its benign tone disavows or leaves unrecognized, a structure and a feeling of repressed recognition that the poem also thematizes, thus bringing to consciousness not so much the content of what is repressed as the indeterminate sense of its repression, an economy of memory and forgetting powerfully formulated by the statement that the sea takes and gives memory. If the poem's handling of maritime trade and of warfare is fond, so that is credulous, foolish, simple, or unthinking in its over-affectionate identification with the life world attending an economic and political context that its author seems not to understand, and if the poem also registers the threat of falling into more serious contemplations, so it is no good to be forlorn with mortal thoughts, it's precisely the relationship between these affective tonalities and cognitive states, so the poem's movement between blithe, grave, and wistful recollective modes, that the poem seems to be about, and which it thematizes as the conceptual problem and emotional experience of remembrance. The reflective inscription of remembrance as repressed recognition is legible in the poem's registration of lyric subjectivity as self-forgetting. So the lyric I appears only once in the poem, so that I might rest, for sleep would be sweet under shadows, articulating the lyric subject in and through the desire for unconsciousness. It is shadow and sleep that the I desires, its own oblivion, brought about not by wine per se, but by the dark light with which the fragrant cup is full, replete with the substance of repressed recognition, of obscure illumination, of what is remembered as forgotten or forgotten as remembered. To be I is to be solitary, forlorn with mortal thoughts, and to desire reprieve from solitary consciousness. To be me is to be affected by another. So someone is asked to pass me the fragrant cup. Memories of Bordeaux come back to me, noch denket das mir. remembrance happens to the lyric subject, and this makes of that subject an object, so that in this poem, to assume the grammatical position of the I is to forget, to sleep under shadows. Thus, the receptivity of lyric remembrance is integral to its capacity to exceed the determinations of conscious intentionality. Yet this unconscious excess affects the consciousness of the subject, pressing upon the determinations of understanding and reflection, such that the I pursues a defensive movement from mortal thoughts to the sweetness of slumber. It's the sentence in which the image of the brown women appears that mediates this movement from the receptivity of remembrance to the lyric subject's evasion of consciousness or of conscious reflection upon death and finitude. So the second strophe, still this comes back to me, and how the broad crowns of the elmwood bend over the mill, but a fig tree grows in the courtyard. On festive days, the brown women walk just there, on silken ground, in time of March, when night and day are equal, and lulling breezes draw down leisurely paths, heavy with golden dreams. So this second strophe of the poem opens with a sentence recalling local particulars, the crowns of the elmwood, the mill, the fig tree, the courtyard. These are recalled grammatically as subjects and as objects. So the broad crowns of the elmwood bend over the mill, or the fig tree grows in the courtyard. The speaker recalls how they bend and grow, that is, what it was like, the singular sense of how these trees are situated within and relate to their environment, where they descend and ascend in turn. While these particulars recall the specificity of place, it's then the specification of time that begins the second sentence of the strophe, so on festive days. Through the passage of the brown women, the sentence moves from time to place, so from just there on silken ground, place, then back to calendrical time in time of March, and the equinoctial equality of day and night, when night and day are equal. Implicitly, singularity of place is drawn into relation with the annual orbit of the Earth around the sun, with the lunar cycle, and with the 24-hour cycle of the Earth's rotation around its axis. Henrik suggests that, quote, the hushed movement of the image and the punctual occasion of the vernal equinox involve an elevated awareness and experience of the day lifted up out of the cycle of seasons. But it would be just as easy to argue that the equinox actually situates us not only within the cycle of seasons, but also within a specific historical conjuncture. As Lefebvre argues, the poem gives us the calendrical coordinates to know that we're situated just prior to the signing of the Treaty of Amiens on March 25th. As Lefebvre does not argue, however, those coordinates also situate us on the same day that Napoleon's proclamation to the inhabitants of Saint-Domingue is printed in the Bordeaux press, and also only 2 days after L'Écho de Commerce reports that Toussaint's forces had gone to war against Leclerc. So if we're lifted up out of the cycle of seasons, the poem's reference to a certain moment in that cycle also brings us down to earth, amid the complex, contradictory determinations of history. And these inflect the image of the brown women with weighty questions that might indeed amount to mortal thoughts, though we cannot know the content of those thoughts mentioned in the following strophe. The ambiguous signifiers of lyric remembrance may imply what they do not or cannot make explicit. They may suggest more than intention can delimit. They may draw upon elements of collective concern or historical context that are well beyond the reflective consciousness of individuals, even as these pass through or subtend such consciousness, determinations of reflection that are unreflected in understanding. The brown women walk, so that is, they are grammatical subjects, but the strophe ends with the suggestion that they are also drawn down leisurely paths by lulling breezes. Here, the brown women, or others on these paths, are positioned as both subjects and objects, drawn down the paths they walk upon, which are heavy with golden dreams. So already the desire of the eye to rest in the following strophe is anticipated by these golden dreams and lulling breezes, which affect the brown women who walk on festive days. The sweet and shadowed slumber of the lyric subject, which absolves the eye of mortal thoughts, is itself drawn into the poem by the implicitly exotic mood of the previous strophe, as the brown women, the silken ground, the lulling breezes, leisurely paths, and golden dreams come together with the dark light of the fragrant cup. So here we're proximate to the maritime world of Baudelaire's L'Invitation au Voyage, where the port city in the poem drifts off to sleep with hyacinth and gold amid warm illumination. Thus, while the brown women of Ondenken may be taken by Adorno to represent what he calls the erotic imago of the Mediterranean woman, we can recognize that they also participate in the construction of a common trope of European colonial poetics. That is, the infusion of the metropole with the exotic mood and balmy climate of the colonies, the tranquil rest of a tropical reprieve from the rigors of mortal thoughts. So this is a topos to which Holderlin also alludes before leaving Nördlingen in his letter to Bollendorf, right, in his reference to Tahiti. The sensuous texture of the tone and colors that Henrik finds in the second strophe belong to this exotic imaginary, so common to depictions of the Orient, of Africa, and the Caribbean in 19th century European poetry. And the fact that this exoticizing trope may be recognized as consistent with the representation of southern France and with the imagination of the tropics is exactly the point. That is, Bordeaux is the sort of place where these come together. And this fusion of European and tropical atmospheres is the very element of the foreign in this poem. Thus, it makes sense that, amid the defensive retreat from mortal thoughts in the third strophe of the poem, we should move from soothing sleep to conversational bonhomie, from grave meditations to tales of love and deeds. Insofar as these stories have a kind of palliative function, they're also implicitly invested with a desire not to reflect too closely on historical realities underlying tales of colonial adventure. This is the function of ideology, which is operative here in the form of vernacular sociality. The poem ponders the question of its own disorientation, but where are the friends? It remarks on and displaces its own evasions. Some shy away from going to the source. And it passes from the maritime origins of wealth to the aesthetic bounty of trade and to the courage of the mariners who go to war, who live alone under the stripped mast, without the sheltering crowns of the elmwood. Whereas the end of the second strophe might be taken to synthesize the distance of the tropics with the locality of the metropole, the end of the fourth strophe now posits these in opposition. So those at sea are where no city festival, nor play of strings, nor native dance glimmers through the night. Seafaring is now described as the negation of the comforts of home. For the speaker who remembers from afar, let's say from Germany in 1803, both the foreign city and the foreignness of the sea to the city constitute liminal regions where consciousness flows into the reaches of the unconscious, and where the negative power of that passage, the manner in which it bears upon thinking, feeling, and writing through the dialectical structure of recognition, comes to constitute the concluding sense of the poem. So that sense sets out in the final strophe from erasure, revision, catachresis, and departure, as we've seen in this handling of the manuscript. It traces the movement from land to sea. At the windy peak where the Dordogne converges with the Garonne by the Vineyard Hills, referencing the place in which grapes are grown for the wine trade. Since wealth begins in the sea, these vineyard hills are also a reference to the water cycle, the evaporation of ocean waters and precipitation upon the hills necessary for grapes to grow and for the circulation of rainwater from the rivers back out to the ocean, thus drawing together land and sea, the production and circulation of goods, the geographical and the historical, through a simple topographical denotation. The poem then draws this synthetic movement into an apposition, a drawing together of the sea, of love, and of poetry, the kind of distribution of their faculties in the final lines of the poem. So, but it takes and gives memory the sea, and love also attentively fixes the eyes. but what lasts, the poets establish. So here the grammar of conjunction is of the essence. Together the rivers flow out to sea, but, aber, this movement of departure, of dissolution into a larger body also returns. The sea takes and gives memory, so and, returning the outward movement of the rivers through which they become the sea to the one who observes and describes that transition, the one who remembers it and inscribes it in the poem of remembrance. Recollective thinking then formulates the relation of love to attention through the conjunctive grammar of connection and addition. So, und die Lieb auch heftet fleißig die Augen. Right? So, and love attentively fixes the eyes. What was seen there by the windy peak and what is now seen in the mind's eye is fixed and focused by attention, by care, by the pathos of what matters in experience, or by the singular feeling of love. But within the poem, the referential specification of what was seen and what is remembered, the historically and geographically specific meaning of die braunen Frauen, the brown women, and the departure of the men zu Indiern, or two Indians, is itself indeterminate, that reference. Moreover, that indeterminacy, the destination to which the men have gone, and also is also implicitly laced with a determinate violence. For whether those Indians to whom the men have gone are those of India or of the West Indies, the voyaging of the men participates in deeds that have been done, which are bound up with colonial history, and as we've seen, with the imbrication of peace and war, with the effort to consolidate white supremacy through European treaties. Those days of love about which one might hear, unburdening the heart of mortal thoughts, are themselves replete with death and domination. Such is the content of a political unconscious that the poem may repress, but to which it also testifies, if we limn the recessed implications of the shadows in which the eye sleeps, or of the dark light whose power of forgetfulness the eye remembers. It is said that love also attentively fixes the eyes, but what is unsaid is that this fixation also leaves aside what is unloved, what thus evades the determining gaze of intention, yet which subtends, precisely through that negation, the structure and the limits of what is seen and said. Indeed, which establishes itself in the blind spot at the very center of the field of vision. Thus, what is unseen and unsaid also insists within what the poets establish, within the inscription of what remains and lasts. In the final line of the poem, this faculty of the poets, the capacity to inscribe what remains, is itself positioned by that singular operator of disjunctive conjunction in Hölderlin's Poetics of the word aber, but, posited with and against the additive logic of the und, or and, which had conjoined the sea with love, the economy of remembrance with the fixity of invested attention. In what does this disjunctive element of connection consist? Well, the difference between memory and love, on the one hand, and poetic inscriptions, on the other, is that the latter are inorganic. So this is why what the poets establish remains, why it lasts, why it persists beyond mortality. Poetry inscribes in written characters what love fixes before the attentive eyes of affective life. It records the living memory the sea gives and takes. But the inorganic signifiers of the poem record more than what is directly recognized by individuated attention, more than what is consciously remembered by a living being. Poetry includes this power of excess with which the signifier may come to be invested. It is this confluence of conscious and unconscious recollections inscribed. If, as the closing lines of Patmos suggest, what persists within this power of the strict letter has to be maintained by interpretation or well interpreted by those who come to read it, such interpretation cannot limit itself only to what the poets know, nor can it delimit what the poets know within the parameters of their conscious intentions. The excess of organic memory over consciousness of that memory, the half-conscious or unconscious registration of history that's recorded by written inscriptions may itself be partially recollected. The signs the poets establish have to be interpreted in a manner attending to the exorbitance of their meaning, the excess of what they mean over what they may have been meant to mean, and also interpreted in a manner attending to the indeterminacy of those intentions in the first instance. This is not, however, and here, last paragraph, this is not, however, an absolute indeterminacy. Again, poetic signs invest meaning with determinate fields of indeterminacy, within which history, form, intentional contents, and unconscious representations mingle. The task of historical research and reflection in this paper has been to establish determinations of the field of indeterminate sense that persist within poetic signifiers like Die Braun und Frauen or Zu Indiern. These signifiers cannot be shorn of the historical ambiguities, complications, and contradictions they imply, drawing as they do upon a context located amid the deepest contradictions of modernity, a locus in which the emancipatory dynamics of the French and Saint-Domingue revolutions intersect with reaction and regression, particularly as these bear upon race, slavery, and colonialism. So what's required, I think, to work through what is established by Umdenken is a capacious, historically critical attention to what goes unattended when love fixes the field of the gaze, to what may be overlooked within the field of the visible while persisting within the recesses of remembrance. Okay, end of paper. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. I appreciate it. Okay. This is a piece that I worked on quite a while, and my hope is that it bears upon our theme, but also that it maybe, I don't know, gives a sense of what it's like to try to intervene in certain debates about Holderlin today, having to navigate the criticism, think through historical context, etc. So questions or thoughts on this reading of the poem or any other aspect of this paper? Hmm. Yeah, Peggy.
Well, really made me think how little I know about what was going on in his world and his life, and how the traces of that are really lost to me. And it's just not the language, it's actually the history, the region. So
Yeah,
he's used what he's done with the Greeks and Christianity to a much narrower field here, which makes this almost imperceptible to me. You know,
yeah.
although I loved reading the poem, I thought it was somewhat accessible to me on some other level, but I'm clearly am lacking in an awful lot in this field. So it makes me worry for my final paper, but okay.
Oh, well, you shouldn't be, because I mean the first thing that I want to say is that, so first of all, I mean it's not as though as I'm proposing this as like the reading of the poem or something. This is a highly, I'm obviously highly interested in specific elements of the poem that one can do many other things with this poem, be concerned with many other kinds of questions. So it's not as though uh, this sort of historical work is necessary to write about this poem in a different way, perhaps. But what I was interested in, I mean, what you say applies to me as well. I've been interested in Haiti and the Haitian Revolution for quite a while, but it was only when I really, was translating this poem with my collaborator and started thinking to myself, well, actually, what is going on in the second strophe? What does this really mean, and what is being referred to here? And then started reading in the criticism, and then realizing that I couldn't actually determine, the question, and that many things about the answer to that question have either just been shoved aside or taken for granted. then I got down to the work of, okay, trying to figure out, well, what was happening in Bordeaux in 1802 that would matter to thinking about this question? What do we have to think about if we're trying to figure out what does it mean, Zu Indiern, or what does it mean, the brown women? And then yes, you enter into, you have to go down a sort of rabbit hole and try to figure some things out, which is itself very interesting. But yeah, Peggy, you want to follow up?
Well, I just want to say something else with is a little bit otherwise, but I thought your translation, reading it side to side to the German, did just a beautiful job of the pauses of the caesures and the enjambment. I mean, it takes a really talented poet to enjam lines. So, and you really honored that in your translation into English while I was reading side by side and looked at the punctuation.
Mhm. Thanks, I appreciate that. I mean, one of my own principles in translation is to try to hold on to the punctuation as much as possible.
You did.
And if you do that, which is pretty easy. You just don't change the punctuation. Then it forces a lot of things on you, which can be very productive. So it seems like a small thing, but those structures of enjambment and grammatical subordination, things where you might think, this is in a different, this is a different grammatical structure in English. I can change whatever I want. If you force yourself to hold on to those things and hold on to the lines as much as possible, some interesting things happen. So I appreciate that. Aaron.
Yeah, thank you for that. The paper was really fascinating, and there's like tons of things to dig into. A couple thoughts, and
Yeah.
also apologies if at least two of these might require going back to your translation or something I missed. But the first was just like it's striking me how much there was a doubling of certain images, right? And this doubling being really important. The like night and day, light and dark, the oak and the poplar, the elm and the fig, the
Yeah.
brown women with the men, like the choice to make it men sailing
Yeah.
in contrast to the women, beauty and war. Um, and this kind of pairing of opposites really striking me. And then sometimes they're unified, right, in the dark light. But often they're sort of echoing throughout, which
Yeah.
was really cool. I am really curious to return to Strophe 3, because
Yeah.
it does seem to me like there is, at least in the Hamburger, just an error here. And I couldn't remember whether you had done this, but it's about the number of cups. Actually, it seems like a silly thing. The fragrant cup versus mir eine den duftenden Becher would be one of the fragrant cups, right? Pass me one of the fragrant cups.
Uh-huh.
And it sort of sets a scene of him drinking with people at a festival in this way. And then where are the friends echoes that, and that way that kind of falls out. And I don't remember whether you did got that in your, let's see.
I didn't know. Full of the,
Hmm.
you know, the fragrant cup.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a nice point.
Right. And
Eine den duftenden Becher. Yeah.
right. It's clearly in the plural there, and it makes it so that he's like imagining himself at this festival.
Hmm.
And it's unclear whether he's remembering from the festival with the drink or he's remembering being at the festival. But then, yeah, the absence of the friends, I don't know. I found that image striking and interesting. Um, and then my apologies if you talked a bit about who Bellarmine was, or maybe you could talk a little bit more. A quick Google. It seems to be the like one of the prosecutors of Galileo, some kind of Jesuit priest. Um,
Well, Bellarmine is a character from Holy Reign's
oh,
Hyperion. So it's
okay,
so there's a reference there who's, fighting this war of liberation in Greece, etc. So there's a reference there that comes in from his own.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so the name isn't significant with regard to the historical figure or anything.
Not the one that you have in mind, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was just a quick Google. But no, thank you.
But to come back to what you're saying about what's interesting
The
about
doubling, yeah.
this scene of the festival where, someone passed me um one of the fragrant cups full of the dark light. I mean, it's just amazing, in Henrik and in others, there are all these debates like where would this have been is this in this part of the city? Is this in this other part of the city? Where exactly is he? What sort of people would have been there, et cetera. So it's like, so in this paper, it may be somewhat alarming, these dredging up of the historical particulars from the newspaper, et cetera. But Henrik and other people, this poem has really been picked over in this way, and it's quite interesting in the criticism. I guess the Henrik was assigned, if people read it, the level of detail in that piece is just amazing. I love this essay by him. So it really is uh, a poem in which the specificity of these geographical particulars has really been emphasized and worked over to a kind of astonishing level.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess just one last thought. Like, have you looked into like Holderlin's own, like, I'm thinking of Susan Buck-Morse's book on Hegel in
Yeah,
Haiti and how
yeah.
assuming that because he was a Freemason, he would have had access to these kinds of writings. And do you know anything about Holderlin's own kind of position with regard to Masonry or abolitionism or things like that?
I mean, it's not, yeah, I don't think we have a clear sense of his
Mhm.
position with regard to abolition. And these things are very curious because, I mean, he wasn't a Mason, but certainly he's
Mhm.
involved in circles of like rationalist circles in the 1790s that would have had contacts with those sorts of worlds, you know. Um, but neither he nor Sinclair were a Mason. But
Mhm.
but uh, but particularly when I was researching Beethoven, because of the Eroica and its relationship to Napoleon. Napoleon at exactly this time is such a key figure for thinking about the Eroica Symphony, Beethoven's Third Symphony, and of course there's like tons of writing about this.
Mhm.
And I started and then Beethoven famously was very angry when Napoleon declared himself emperor and supposedly like scratched out the dedication to Napoleon in the Eroica. And this is at exactly the time, when Toussaint had been captured and was being held in a French prison, and then when he died, was like exactly when Napoleon was finishing the Eroica, and Wordsworth wrote a poem, commemorating Toussaint. And so I started looking around, like, did Beethoven know anything about Toussaint? Did he ever refer to Toussaint Louverture or to Haiti, et cetera? Because, of course, he's a Republican, he's a partisan of the French Revolution, pretty similar to Holderlin in his politics. And I
Mhm.
asked the people at the Beethoven House at Bonn, and I sort of asked around, and they were like, no, there's not, we can't find anything. So it is very interesting, that I think that like many of these Germans who are partisans of the French Revolution are not necessarily like exposed, right, to the question of race and slavery and colonialism in the same way, right? So the sort of French universalists who are caught up in the French Revolution, this would have been an extremely pressing concern and a matter of like lived experience in Bordeaux throughout the 1790s. For Holderlin, it probably would have been slightly off the radar, and he probably would have been in favor of abolition. I'm sure he would have been against slavery. But if I ask myself, if Holderlin were reading reports in Bordeaux in March of like Toussaint going to war against Leclerc and Toussaint being called a traitor to the Republic, like what would he have thought if he was having these conversations? I have to say, I just don't know. I don't have a sense of how someone in his position with his politics would sort of process that. Would he think, oh, this is unfair? Of course, Toussaint is like rejecting the reimposition of slavery in Saint-Domingue. Or would he
Mhm.
go along with this broader view, which is like, well, Toussaint ought to remain a sort of loyal general of France and be loyal to Napoleon, et cetera? I think probably the latter, but again, I don't know. So I'm not going to answer that kind of question in a paper
Yeah,
like
yeah.
this. Uh,
Mhm.
but anyway, I think these are key questions,
Yeah.
about the relationship basically between Germany and France and
Mhm.
German partisans of the French Revolution and the French who are sort of more having to deal with these questions, sort of in the thick of these questions, one way or the other. And it's very interesting to think of Holderlin arriving in Bordeaux and just touching upon, the sort of like the vortex of the politics of slavery and colonialism in this winter and spring.
Yeah. One final contextual comment, which this is probably familiar you, but it would be interesting for everyone. And I'm curious if you address these things in your book, is that the echo and the dealing of this with this specifically in East Germany in the post-war period, right? That Anna Zegers has a novel about this. I think it's Heiner Muller has a play specifically about this moment of the revolution being betrayed and what do we do, and
Uh-huh.
like of playing this out. Like it's a
Uh-huh.
weird like focus and working through on those moments among East German writers
Uh-huh.
in the post-war period. That would be fascinating to bring in.
I mean, I haven't thought about that at all. Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah. Um, Other questions people might have, other thoughts, skepticism, objections. I mean, let me ask you. I mean, probably reading this poem and then hearing a paper like this and this question would sort of like reroute a lot of things in the poem. I mean, what's your how do people think about maybe like this way of reading or the stakes of this way of taking up questions in Holderlin? I mean, whatever, as you see, I've sort of read these poems in quite different ways, right? So this reading and the Rhine, these were sort of historical, politically informed readings of those poems, less so maybe with Patmos or with Bread and Wine, etc. But yeah, I don't know. What were you bringing to your readings of this poem, or what did you want to think about before I immersed us in this problematic of like Saint-Domingue and Bordeaux, and how do they maybe relate to one another or come into contact? Other people have thoughts about the poem that they wanted to bring forward before the seminar. Yeah, Nicholas.
Hi. Yeah, so I was thinking that when I first started reading it, I had first read the Adorno text before I delved into the poem, and an immediate thought that I had was, well, at the beginning of the text by Adorno, he kind of uh, makes a point of accusing Heidegger of imbuing Hölderlin with a Heideggerian philosophy, or basically kind of begging the question when reading Hölderlin. And to what extent, I don't know, this is like probably my question, is to what extent we can, I did feel that maybe Adorno kind of could be accused of that also, in a sense that
Yes.
he's maybe reading too much into what he actually wants to say, uh,
Yes.
Hölderlin. Even though, kind of I do like Adorno and, I'm a fan, but I did feel that especially in terms of his reading of Hölderlin, it might have been a bit forced at least. That's my first kind of question, but I have more coming.
I mean, I completely agree with that. Um, I mean, as I think I said the other week, I mean, there are many problems with Heidegger's approach to Holderlin and his appropriation of Holderlin, but I don't think it's fair to just see the situation as Heidegger imposing his philosophy on Holderlin. He himself, in this period, is learning so much from these poems that he will incorporate into his own philosophy. So I've never really bought this, and I find it kind of, obviously for Adorno, I mean, this is the most vexed political context for taking this up. So one can understand, why Adorno um, hates Heidegger, and wants to, and sort of overcompensate in his work on these poems. But I mean, this is a sort of silly way to put it, but in my opinion, Heidegger is a much better reader of Holderlin than Adorno is. And I agree that in this essay, Adorno is, he himself is missing the point at the same time as he's saying that Holderlin misses the point. And so this is part of the reason, is partly because of that piece where it's like, okay, he's saying Heidegger misses and mishandles the problem of the foreign, but then we can see Adorno do the same thing. But then if you come back to saying, oh no, these are women of color in Bordeaux. These are women with a colonial background, as Franz says, or these are emigres from the colonies, etc. Then you also miss the problem, because we don't know. And the fact that we don't know can itself inform us of a lot of things about Bordeaux. We don't know because Bordeaux in the early 17 or in the early 19th century is a place where this is itself ambiguous and complicated, so then attending to that becomes the way of reading. So one
Um,
has to resist over determining, and I think Adorno himself fails to do that a bit.
Sorry, I forgot to mention why I'm saying this, because in the beginning of the text Parataxis, he kind of also goes against a sort of a philological approach.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of interesting that because obviously when I was reading the text, I did have a more philological approach. I was searching all these historical references, what they could mean. So in a sense that I feel like there's this tension between starting from a point of integrating a poem within a philosophical system versus kind of juxtaposing it within its own historical setting. And this is why, because Adorno first goes against sort of a philological approach, then against Heidegger. But this is what, for me, was kind of interesting, that there's a lot of things that could be actually gauged from or via a philological approach or more historical approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Jack and then India.
Um, Thanks for the lecture, Nathan. It was really great. I think maybe I'm a little bit lost. Mm, It's like stuff you said right at the beginning about like you were reading about the historical context that Hölderlin wouldn't necessarily have been aware of or known about, and like using this in the interpretation of the poem, and sort of I thought I really like that wild thing that what is it? Criticism is the truest form of autobiography or something. And the way I sort of see the Heidegger and the Adorno is they each have their bone to pick and their picture of like what they want. The Hölderlin, and Hölderlin allows them to do that in the richest way for each of them, in some
Uh-huh.
sense. And so, do you when when we're raising these questions of colonialism and significance of Hölderlin's poetry, um, in that sense, it feels like you're sort of saying that it speaks to you deeply along these lines when you learn about the history of colonialism and the French Revolution and then the French Empire and stuff. And do you take that as like an attempt to intervene in what you see like presently as the sort of the demand that Hölderlin makes of you or
Uh-huh.
like in the moment? In the same way that I feel like Adorno's shtick is that like Hölderlin's poetry is like critical, and Heidegger's shtick is that it's like German, just put it vulgar.
Yeah. Um, so had you finished? Um, yeah, I mean, well, certainly, I mean, of course, as a critic, I'm trying to think about what matters to me in this poem, and that's motivated in part by other elements of this project, where I'm thinking about Haiti, and the relation between the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution as constitutive of this moment of modernity. And, a long history also of eliding that constitutive status, even though at this point there's been a great deal of work on it. I mean, I would say though that what motivated the approach to it is that there's an interpretive problem in the poem, which is all through the reception. Well, not all through it, but through a lot of the reception of the poem. That is to say, even at the most basic level, what does this mean, the brown women, die braunen Frauen? What does this mean, zu Indien? What's the significance of the manuscript revision? So these very sort of, in some sense, like boring questions of just establishing the basic materials that you need to do sort of a reading of the significance of the second strophe of this poem. So either right? Either you confront those questions or you don't. And if you don't, fine, you're thinking about something else, whatever. But then you see, right? Then you get into this problem and you say, oh, like you start learning something about Bordeaux in the 1790s and the early 19th century, and you see that this is a deeply ambiguous question. And then you see, like, if you're reading Henrik, you're like, oh, well, Henrik is saying, Bordeaux is the most important merchant point, et cetera. And he's like not mentioning slave trade, So it's important to him to think about Bordeaux in relation to the Atlantic world, in relation to, the mercantile economy. And it's important to him to think about what the meteorological conditions would be under which the ground can be referred to as silken, right? But it's not important to him to ask why the women are called the brown women, probably because he assumes that these are, white women working in the vineyards in France who have a suntan, which may well be the case. But what's interesting, I think, about Holderlin's intentions, or, one might think, oh, I'm reading so much into this poem, and this is because of a certain present incentive. I mean, that's perfectly, well, I'm sure true in some sense. But my thing about the poem, and in this way I'm a formalist, the poem exists. I mean, Friedrich Holderlin is dead, and the poem is right in front of us. And that's what he means when he says, but what remains or what lasts, the poets establish. So what does the poem establish? And then you try to say, okay, well, what does it mean, where the brown women walk on silken ground? And then obviously it matters to people whether that means women who work in the vineyards, the erotic imago of the Mediterranean woman, or whether it means something else, which draws us into these massive problems with racialization, the history of modernity. And in fact, even if they work in the vineyards, it's the same thing because the wine is bought and sold in this way. It's like, but so what's interesting to me is that the poem says that. So whatever Holderlin thought he was saying, you know, this is what the poem says, and this is what we have to work with. And we, in fact, cannot establish what Friedrich Holderlin had in his mind when he wrote the poem. Maybe we could if we had more materials, if we had letters in which he was, but we don't. So, um, so what's interesting is that in the process of working through that very problem, if you're doing research, you have to figure out, actually, is there something somewhere where I can figure out something about the poet's intention? And then you get to the point of saying, no, I know enough to say there isn't. Um, so what's interesting from a literary critical point of view is that the poem becomes very powerful when it simply says what it says, and you can't refer it to something else that would solve the problem. And now the problem itself inhabits the poem. And you can either turn away from the problem, say, whatever, this doesn't matter to me as much, or you can work on the problem. And if you work on the problem, then you have to figure out a way to read poetry that allows these ambiguities or indeterminacies to remain indeterminate, but without just saying the poem is indeterminate, because then you have nothing. So to determine a field, of indeterminacy, which the poem evokes and calls into being. And so Holderlin, whether he knew about these, he definitely knew something about them. He's in Bordeaux and people are talking about it. It's all through his world. But whatever he thought about it, it gets into the poem through these elements. And here it gets into the poem through indeterminacies. So also in a chapter that I've written on Baudelaire, on the poem Obsession, and this word in the poem toile, which can either mean canvases, like, for painting, or webs. You can show that you actually can't decide, you can't determine whether it means webs or canvases. And so now the poem really says what it says, toile, right? It's not an object. It doesn't draw, it doesn't put like a painting in the poem. It says the word toile, and now you have a signifier. So these things to me are important in like letting the poem be what it is. So I would actually argue that while this is a very strong reading of this poem in a certain sense, definitely bringing into it a lot that a lot of people might think is not really there. It also, for me, is just a way of of respecting what this poem actually says, and then not turning the poem into something else, some referent, some other source, you know. And so learning how to read in that way has just been something I've been like trying to develop methodological tools for. In a way, I think it's very Demonian. It's like showing that the poem is what it is, and that you can't just turn it into something else. And the task of interpretation is to kind of make it manifest. Okay, India and then Bagum.
So I apologize because I am way over my head. I am not an academic, I am a writer.
Wonderful.
So the way that I approach, because I didn't have like a grasp on Heidegger that would be useful for me, I never read the Holdering. So what I try to do is that first I try to approach through Greek mythology because that's the absence that he's singing about, the absence of that god, that myth. I went through Iliad, Homer,
Okay.
all the things. I read a lot about what Holdering said about it, about Achilles, about Homer, about Iliad as well, in the essays and letters. I love how mean he is towards Germans in the letters. It doesn't look like in the poetry. Uh, and another thing is that I was doing another seminar about like this. It was White Words, Lost Lands, that is about myth a little bit. And we
Uh-huh.
had this piece of Bataille that is the absence of myth. And I don't know, the ideas got a little bit mixed up in my head, and I start thinking about that this similar moment that we are right now, of the loss of the sacred, of this coming of a new era, a new age, a new science, a new technology. And yeah, I'm trying to decipher through it, like if you can approximate this attempt of Holdering of creating a mythology for the German people. I also got a paper about was about Baudelaire, Holdering, and Wordsworth. That was about the sense of community that is poets try to bring with their poetry. So I think I'm all over the place, but that was my approach to it all, and I think somehow it connects to the ideas that you shared today.
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I mean, this is a very peculiar poem because you don't really see Holderlin here trying to create something like a new mythology, whereas in the Rhine you do, right? So there, although in the Rhine also, I don't really know. The German people is also such an ambiguous reference because you have German-speaking people, and Holderlin will refer to obviously the Germans or to himself as a German. But then, he's in Swabia. You have these regional, areas which are in some sense more important than, there is no Germany in the way that we think of it now. And so this creation of this mythological project anyway, and this sort of nostalgia or the sentimental relation to myth, to put it in Schiller's terms, that we find in Holderlin, I think, very much corresponds to this moment of crisis in the relationship between theology and philosophy and science that constitutes modernity. Whereas for us today, like I'm struck, the the crisis of the sacred or something. But then of course, like sometimes I think to myself, well, there are far more people in this world who believe in God in the most traditional Orthodox manner, than who are secular. I mean, and so sometimes I don't like, the sort of trajectory of modernity and this movement of like secularization, which probably seemed for a generation in the late 18th century, early 19th century, as something that was going to like sort of displace religion. I mean, that has proven very much not to have been the case. So I don't know. Anyway, I guess what I would say is it's interesting to look at a poem like this in relation to a poem like The Rhine, and to see how the problem of remembrance here is evoking a different kind of poetic project than the rendering of the river as a demigod. Like even the sea here is not really, it's not mythologized. It's very much, it's thought of almost in metaphysical terms. But it's not given a proper name. It's not really allegorized. It's not really mythologized, etc. So, but yeah, I think your approach to Holderlin is a good one. You know, going back to the Greeks and reading a lot of the Greeks, I think this makes perfect sense. Begum.
Thank you. First of all, is my voice okay? Can you hear me?
It's pretty loud, but I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about the music. My questions will be kind of messy because this was a whole new introduction. I thought that I don't know why I thought that, like with Heidegger and the Adorno discussion, I was like very captivated by the discussion, so I forgot altogether like the historical background, but like contextualizing it this way and like grounding it in Bordeaux was like quite informative. I just wanted to ask that you couple of times emphasized remembrance as repressed recognition. That's can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah.
This is my like first question, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that in a way this is, and I might, in the longer version of this in the chapter, there's sort of more on this, and I should perhaps add even more yet, because yeah, the title of the poem is very important, you know, for thinking about this problem. It's like, what's the relationship of memory or remembrance, recollective thinking, you know, to inscription? That's the real problem here. So, you know, but what lasts or but what remains, the poets establish. So that's they inscribe, you know, the strict letter. And but that draws upon, and we see this like amorphous, ambiguous, metaphysical, historically rich field of memory and recollections whose boundaries are quite amorphous, you know, and all of that gets into the poem. And Holderlin's poetological writings are extraordinary on this question, you know. And in one version of this piece, I had like 10 pages on the poetological writings, and then I took it out because I was like, this is too much. But in the poetological writings, he's talking about sort of the matter of the poem in terms of the kind of, how to put it, like the primary experience that the poet is rendering in the poem, you know, but then how there's a kind of unity of this experience with which the poet is imbued. And then in the writing of the poem, right, the poem has to pass through these different moods or episodes, you know. So for example, like moods that could be lyric or epic or tragic. And so then the unity of this experience that the poet is trying to render in the poem is differentiated by the movement of the poem itself. And the poem has to hold this together and establish a kind of harmonious unity of the differential articulation of the singularity of the experience which is rendered in the poem. So Holderlin is obsessed with this problem, you know, which is, I would put it, the relationship between the strict determinacy of the poem, what the characters on the page actually say, and the amorphous field of history, experience, feeling, emotion that goes into the poem. Now, the point here, one could do this in many different ways with many different poems and even this poem. But the point here is like, okay, well, we have these interpretive problems on the poem, which have very weighty historical, you know, questions attached to them, which people handle in one way or another. And now this is exactly the sort of thing which is at stake in what Holderlin is talking about. So the brown women, it's like, for him, it meant we don't know, you know, but because of where he was and the historical complex of the place where he was and the time when he was there, now the poem, this is in the poem, whether he meant it to be in the poem or not. That is to say, it is an interpretive problem that we encounter if we think through this poem and what it is remembering. That is, we can't establish. So now it's in this strange, region. And so anyway, my point in the piece is that it's precisely memory, where this problem is at issue because it's the problem is the relay between the organic faculties of the living being who writes the poem and the inorganic, remainder of those organic faculties of the living being. And memory is absolutely crucial to that. I mean, whatever, if you're a Bergsonian, it's like we are memory. That's what we, in some sense, are this sort of like boundary between like memory, consciousness, the unconscious. Like what we are is like a field of memory that is like inscribed all throughout our bodies. And so the poem is this curious artifact where just linguistically, through reference, these ambiguities of recollection enter into the field of what is said and what is known. And I think that the relation between consciousness and the unconscious, like memory, is a powerful sort of field for thinking through this problem. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, and then this the thing that you say about what the poem is in general trying to do, and then we have this poem which also tackles this issue at the end, whereas itself is a poem. So in this so does it like so normally I don't want to mystify this art like the poetry, but like normally the poets, even though it has like this conscious like intention of establishing something or writing about something or like capturing something, it kind of gets abandoned in the way of writing the poem. But whereas in this specific one, it kind of reappears at the end as like fully acknowledging what poem is about. So this full acknowledgement, does this have any like historical roots about what we have talked about Bordeaux or any other stuff? Or maybe like Adorno, I think, kind of connected to Hegel, and then we have this like second scale, like this middle scale of like this philosophical thought, which is like born in Germany, but also like Adorno argues that like there are some like Hölderlin is exiled at the end, so it's not quite German as well. So there's a different kind of a historical understanding that is going on there too. I mean, I don't want to make it too confusing, but like, yeah.
I think, okay, so I mean, every art form has its resources, for offering up reflexive meditations or statements, on its own practices. So here, yes, it's true. This poem, not unlike Patmos, is notable for the way in which it seems to like theorize, or at least certainly not theorize, but like bring into focus at the end, it states a sort of like thesis almost on a certain poetic problem. What remains the poets establish. And so the question is, what's the relationship between the sea, love, and the poem? And the poem is very explicit about like making this offering up a kind of summary statement on this at the end of the poem. So it's an important text for us in thinking about Hölderlin's poetological writings, and so is Patmos for the same reason. I would just say, I mean, to your question at the end, like, yes, I do think it's important that it's when Hölderlin goes somewhere where his experience touches upon the ocean, the sort of unbounded expanse of all that he does not know and everywhere he has not been, that this economy of memory and this question of what is fixed in attention by love, and then what is established by the signifier, that this vast amorphous like world of the sea that Hölderlin is just barely in contact with. Bordeaux is way in from the sea, it's like, but the river flows out. And so this liminal site is the place where this relationship between the sea, love, and poetry is established in the poem. So this is, and I would just say that is one way to think about it is almost just spatially, right? The sea is vast, it's narrowed into the river to this place. This is a very interesting topological figure of what is not known or memory, et cetera, to what is determined. But here also, the crucial thing, right? Geography has been played up so much in thinking about this poem, but history here, in relation to the geography of the Atlantic world, just bears so heavily, on what's happening in this place and time that that all of that gets dragged in to this last formulation. So and I would just say, yeah, the boundaries of how we're supposed to prescribe that or open it up, how much we're supposed to think about or pay attention to. I mean, the process of writing this piece for me was interesting because I came to understand like how open a question that really is. So I do think, yeah, anyway, the end of the poem is quite weighty in that sense. Connell, I think you have a question.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I actually wanted to ask about the ending as well. I apologize, I was kind of in and out a little bit during the talk, so I apologize if I missed anything, but or anything that's relevant to this. Um, but I guess I just had like a kind of fairly basic interpretive question about just trying to understand a little more um how you see the dynamics of these three moments of the ocean that takes. Well, I'm looking at another translation I found online. So I apologize if, or maybe it'll be interesting if you can remind me of the differences in yours. But um, the ocean that takes and gives memory, then love capturing one's eyes, and then what the poets provide being that which remains. So just like the different, um, like what is this distinction between um, I guess firstly remembrance as opposed to what
Yeah.
remains, and then what that which takes and gives memory, and then that which takes attention in love, and exactly then where I guess how the status of what remains and of remembrance bears upon your whole account of the historical kind of implications of the poem, I guess.
Yeah, you maybe did miss the part where I talked about this. So
I'm
I
sorry.
yeah, I went through the last three lines. I mean, I would say that the main point that I made or that I would make now is just that it's this thing about, love also attentively fixes the eyes. It's that so what's the difference between like love and what the poets establish? And the argument was that, the being that loves, that is involved in this affective investment, is a living being. And what the poets established is an inorganic text, and so the relationship between the inorganic, between affective life and the inorganic remainder of the poem is partly a question of the economy of attention, which is brought into focus by the giving and taking of memory by the sea, right? So it's like the sea gives and takes memory. Love fixes the gaze. So some things are remembered or attended to, and some things are not, right? So presumably what is unloved, is not, the gaze is not fixed upon it. Um, but I think that the end of this poem, yeah, we have to think very carefully about the relation between the organic and the inorganic. And this is largely what's at stake in this relationship between invested affective attention and the remainder. And so it's because the poem remains after the poet is dead, you know, that what the poet loves, in some sense, what is attended to in the poem can be ambiguous. That is, you can't just ask, And now this is a sort of formalist argument about why we have to work with the poem as we do. So, I do, yeah, I think that the memory is very much an organic capacity here, but it's one that relies upon an inorganic inscription, and this relay between the two is what's at stake in those final lines.
Yeah, I guess it's just because I mean the ocean one might
Yes.
consider inorganic.
Yes.
So that, but you make the link is between the ocean and love, and then what poets provide is distinguished from both of them, if I'm
Yes, I
understanding.
mean, I think that yeah, exactly. There's this relay between like the enormity of this inorganic element, which is a
Mm,
key thing throughout Holderlin, the poetics of the elements,
yeah,
the way that it comes into contact, let's put it this way, with the economy, the economy of what is taken and given by the sea comes into attention with or into relation with the
economy of
economy of
attention.
attention.
Yeah.
And now something is established that remains, which requires a further reduction, a
Mm,
setting forth in graven characters.
yeah.
And and uh, and what I would see about this element, the sea, it's crucial in the archipelago. It for Holderlin, it is essentially a medium of communication. It allows the gathering of things from different places and they're bringing together by here, like these mariners, or by the poets. And this is also very important because it's like this whole Atlantic world, you know, of colonial trade and commerce is bound up with the activity of poetic writing for Holderlin because both of them bring together the beauties of the earth, right? So now, yes, if we situate this inorganic element of communication and passage and travel in relationship to the real historical conditions with which this moment in Bordeaux is embroiled, now we have an interesting problem. Is
Yeah.
this like a peaceful representation of the reconciliation of everything it is, like Dieter, Henrik thinks? Or is it something where that is certainly in play, but it's inflected and contradicted by, you know, this, the very, the peak moment in the contradictions of the problem of freedom in modernity, right? Between the French Revolution and the reimposition of slavery. So basically the relationship between freedom and equality. Um, so yeah, I think, it is interesting that all of those historical political problems and all of these metaphysical problems are drawn together through this sort of relay between the inorganic elements, the organic, sort of faculty to love or pay attention, and then the
Yeah.
inorganic inscription of the relay between those.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Marty.
Hi. So I had two questions, and the first one is pretty basic, I guess. And it's just about the word Andenken, which, if I'm not mistaken, can also mean like memento or
Yeah,
keepsake.
it
And
can
so
mean
I'm
like a
wondering,
souvenir. Yeah.
yeah, and it
Like a
seems like that's kind of directly at issue in the poem itself. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, one way to read like what is lasting the poets provide is like the poem itself is a kind of memento. And so I'm wondering if you see that relation between the sort of we were talking about like what remains and the process of memory in the act of writing, whether that's registered in the title itself, that kind of double meaning of process of recollection and the memento.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Actually, I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms. Yes, that this token would be like a thing, and so it's both memory and a sort of reified object. And what I think is notable about that too, just think about it, right? If you have a souvenir from somewhere, I mean, it's a perfect, just think about how often it's the case, or probably inevitably the case, right? That you have this thing, which is a token of remembrance of some place, and it's of course invested with all of these meanings that you do not understand. And what's so fascinating about that, it's like it's precisely because it's an inorganic thing. It can't speak, it can't tell you what it means, and you have it. You think it's your possession, and it's your token of something that you want, that you intended to be a token of. But it bears within itself this bizarre, peculiar power to accrete historical meaning, you know, that in fact you are probably unaware of. And so your own faculty of remembrance, which would seem to exceed the sort of determinacy of this object, is in fact radically exceeded by the power of mnemonic sort of condensation that it bears within it. But that's only because of the faculty of someone who interprets, whether it's you or someone else. That is, someone who can add context, someone who can push beyond intention. this is why I think like, the sort of I will say, okay, I'm a literary critic. This is why I actually think literary criticism, Adorno says this. Adorno in aesthetic theory, he's like, art needs interpretation. It begs for, it calls out for interpretation. Interpretation adds to the artwork. It makes it what it is. It answers it and allows it to exist. And you can see in thinking about the poem as a souvenir, as a little token of remembrance, which is inorganic, exactly how that works. Like some poet, this is why it drives me crazy, in some of these debates where, like, Walter Ben Michaels, for example, wants to make these very strong claims for the import of artistic intention. It's true that artistic intention is necessary to constitute an artwork. However, artistic intention can in no way determine or delimit the field of meaning of the artwork. This is a totally different question. And if it could, we would lose exactly what the figure of the souvenir brings into focus, right? Which is that all these things accrete to the object, which is not like they're just added on post facto. They're really there. Um, and interpretation cannot know in advance how much there is to give back of that like implicit determinacy of the existing thing which cannot speak. Um, so I'm never convinced, by these efforts to sort of reground correct interpretation in the determinacy of intentions, or intentions as the sort of framing thing that we should think about just because intentionality is necessary to constitute artworks. It's a kind of a false syllogism that we could move from one to the other. Nicholas.
Hi again. Yeah, I just wanted to, because I really liked where the conversation was going, I wanted to basically kind of mention that, when I started reading the poem, I kind of stayed quite a long time in the title, and I wanted to connect it, maybe wrongly, we'll see, but to what you said in your paper about sort of about the last line where basically it says that what is lasting is what the poet creates, basically. Um, so context, last month I had a kind of conversation with some friends about Aristotle, and we're talking about memory. And it was quite funny that basically I kind of went digging and I found an interesting kind of connection perhaps with which could be useful here, because for Aristotle there is this kind of differentiation he makes between mneme or memory and memora, and kind of bringing to memory as mnemonevin and anamnesis. And the basic difference is that anamnesis is always a conscious act, which is mediated through language, instead of, say, remembering as a passive affective perception, which he says that basically also animals can do, and also goes on to say other stuff like, for example, I don't know, if you're in good health, you can remember more accurately or stuff like that. But basically, anamnesis is interesting because it seems to be almost like this domain of the poet that Helderlin describes as this like conscious recollection, which is not just instant, but I think Aristotle has this like interesting kind of way of talking about these memory images, that you're trying to put them together in a way that they resonate the most intense feeling of what you want to bring back. But I don't know, maybe you know more about this. I wanted to bring it.
No, I just think it's a very interesting question. Again, it bears upon some of these things that Holderlin is clearly obsessing over in his poetological writings, which again, I would say these essays, if you go read like Das Werden im Vergehen, it's like I mean, it seems like it makes no sense, and then you read and you read and you read and you spend an hour on every paragraph and you work, whatever with the German and back and forth or whatever, if you can just read it in German, great. But if you're, and then it's like, and then you realize the thing is actually just clear as day and totally rigorous, and it's hard because it's so incredibly meticulous. But but what matters to him, right, is that yes, because there's an intentionality of memory, but what really matters for Holderlin is feeling. It's feeling that has to, because he's like, he's saying these things. It's a beautiful formulation that like, uh, these elements of things that are going on in the world will like enter into the poet through emotion. He uses this phrase in the limbs of the existing world. So it's like these, it's like these things which are barely touching on like parts of the world or the poet, that are, and then it's the feeling that has to bring them into the poem. That's the unity. That's intellectual intuition, actually, for Holderlin. That's the absolute. You know, it's this like uh, production of the poem out of a unity of feeling, which has to be sustained, and then the poem will deflect and alter this and complicate it, etc. And then it has to be preserved in the poem. If that's to sort of like prevail and get to the other side of this process, then it's this feeling. So it's very important, I think, actually, that for Holderlin, um, memory or the material in this poem, it is memory, but the material that's getting into the poem, that it not be too conscious, right? If one were just trying to consciously bring together all the elements in a way which is, then you would lose the unity of the feeling which has to bring them into the poem. So the problem is, I think, to write the poem in such a way that intentionality obviously is there. It's not like Holderlin doesn't know what he's doing, but that it doesn't like cancel out the unconscious field, the unintentional field of feelings which are sort of passing through the inscription of the poem. So because that's so difficult to talk about, that's why these poetological writings, I think, are so incredibly complex. Um, but yeah, anyway, these things are coming up to do with intentionality and its relationship to memory, which anyway are very important to sort of like worry over and think through. Um, what's the Aristotle? What Aristotle are you thinking of, actually? Is it?
In Physica, in
Yeah,
I don't know how you say it in English, but
yeah,
there was this section that I was reading about memory. It goes into great detail about other stuff, but for me, mostly it was about the fact that he kind of mentions that for anamnesis to occur, it requires one, the passage of time, so it's not an instant remembrance, but also pathos and
yeah,
haste. So that's kind of interesting that it has to have sort of you have to have a stake in doing it. It's not an instant uh,
yeah.
kind of mechanical thing that you do.
Yeah. Well, okay, on that note, let me offer some concluding remarks then on the whole seminar, just briefly, and then we can go to some of these logistical questions that are coming up with final assignments to wrap up. But I would just say that's a nice sort of segue to a conclusion to the overall seminar, because precisely bringing up pathos, I think that this poem, I put it last in the seminar because the pathos of modernity is like, this poem is a key poem for thinking about what is meant by the pathos of modernity. That is, that one has to not only suffer, but undergo the feeling of historical experience, and that undergoing is a sort of passive reception of historical experience, which then has to be actively rendered in the artwork. Um, and that pathos is in some sense this mediation between being a subject and being an object, where the receptive faculties of the subject enable a conversion of feeling into the artwork. And so Umdenken, I think, is a key is a key text where, again, these scales of geography and history, the relation of the sea to the port, to the river, you get this focalization of vast expanses into the written signifier. And precisely then, I would argue, like this paper is one way of taking up the pathos of modernity in this poem and saying there's more here than Holderlin being exposed to the foreignness of the French, or of this sort of different climate that he's at while he's in Bordeaux. There's the whole sort of complex of slavery and colonialism and modernity, which is also entering into the field of this poem. Why? Because the poet is undergoing, because the pathos of modernity is working on the poet. So I think that term, right, when we're reading a modern poet like Holderlin, is a way of thinking not only what are the conscious intentions of the poet, but what is being undergone in the historical world that is touched upon by this poetic text and that enters into it. So I guess that's ultimately what I have in mind. And I think we've traversed now a number of different sort of like entry points into thinking about that problem through these four major texts, hopefully. I do want to turn to questions people have that are coming up about final projects, submissions, etc. So Peggy is asking, do we have a folder to submit the final projects? I will put that up online. I will put up a comment up online also, with more information along those lines. But just keep in mind that you are totally welcome to email me with any questions that you have, but there'll be an assignment sheet and there'll be a folder for submission of the final project soon. Yeah. Any other questions people have about essays, or things like that? Okay. Well, yeah, so if you haven't done a discussion post yet, do a discussion post. I look forward to reading your final projects, which of course I'll send you comments on. Thank you everybody for attending this seminar. It's been a real pleasure for me. I've been telling everyone I know how incredibly interesting and smart my students are in this seminar, so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Well, bye for now, folks. So again, get in touch if you want to. Ciao, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Hi,
very
thank you,
much.
Nathan.
Thank you.
Hey, Nathan,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, bye.
Fantastic. Bye.